Good afternoon and welcome to SIS. My name is Carolyn Gallagher and I'm the Senior Associate Dean here in SIS, and I'm just so pleased that so many of you joined us. It's always great when you have to get more chairs out for an event, so thank you for coming. I want to welcome you again today to our SIS and Transatlantic Policy Center event, Ambassadors Up Close, Nordic Security Transformed, Spotlight on Finland and Sweden. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed guests. Mikko Hautala is Finland's ambassador to the United States. He first joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2001 and has had an illustrious career, serving in a number of important roles prior to his current ambassadorship, including, but certainly not limited to, First Secretary of the Permanent Representation of Finland to the EU, Deputy Head of Mission to the Embassy of Finland in Russia, and most recently as Finland's ambassador to Russia. Our second panelist today is Karen Olofsdotter, and she is Sweden's ambassador to the United States. Since 1994, when she first joined Sweden's Foreign Service, she has also served in a number of crucial roles and had an illustrious career. Her positions include many, and I'll just mention three here. She was the Deputy Chief of Mission to at the Embassy of Sweden in DC, Sweden's ambassador to Hungary, and most recently, the Director General for Trade at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Our moderator today, is Garrett Martin. He is a professor in the School of International Service and the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center. He is an expert on U.S. foreign policy, NATO, and European politics. He's also a frequent contributor to media outlets, including NPR, BBC, CNN, and France 24. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dean Gallagher, for the introduction. Thank you for all of you to being here, especially on a beautiful day outside, so it's particularly appreciated. And great thanks as well to both the Swedish and the Finnish embassy for all their help in making this event possible. I would be remiss if I didn't start this event by at least expressing our deep thoughts and prayers and sympathy for the peoples in Turkey and Syria who are dealing with the terrible impact of the earthquake and the tragedy, and our thoughts to all the rescue teams from across the world that are really in a race against time to make sure they can save as many lives as possible. So let me start with a biographical question, if I may, because you've had a very distinguished careers and you've served in very crucial posts. And I want to start with Ambassador Hautala. Obviously, your previous post happened to be in Russia. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us, what did you see in your 4 years in terms of a change in Russian attitude, a hardening of Russian positions, and as well as your interaction with the senior Russian leadership in that period? What stood out from that most recent experience?
Thanks. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. And great to see so many guests. So my years in Moscow were 2016 and 2020. And I think one of the features that was growing constantly was the importance of history in the Russian thinking. So they had this imperial idea of Russia as a great power. And one of the concepts that didn't fit into that theory was the fact that Ukraine was a sovereign, independent country. So the increase of this kind of historical thinking that this is a thing that Russians don't tolerate no longer. You perhaps remember a couple of article by President Putin, actually 2 years ago, then Prime Minister Medvedev. So this kind of turn towards history, turn towards this imperial thinking. It was not so visible in everyday life in Moscow, but it was a kind of a trend that was growing. I don't think many of us fully realized it at the moment when it happened, but now in the aftermath, I think that's one of the things that was a worrying sign, and we could have, and certainly personally, I could also observe it with my contacts in Russia.
So, Ambassador Olofsdotter, I was tempted to ask you, since it's your second stint in Washington, if you found Washington to be changed, but that might be a very different question. But You did serve in the Swedish delegation to NATO. And so I'm wondering if you can speak about that experience and whether that deepening partnership over the years facilitated the terrain for the current application.
Yes, thank you for that question. And when it was my second posting as a diplomat. So I went there in 98 after having been in Moscow. And up till a year ago, I never thought really that we would join NATO. There are political parties in Sweden that would have liked to see that for a long time, but the biggest political party in Sweden has not had that on its agenda. So, joining or being at NATO in that time was very much about partnership for peace. We had the Russia-NATO Council. Of course, we were not members, but they were there. We thought it was another day. And then, of course, 2000, with Putin entering the scene, gradually changed things. But what's interesting is that both Finland and Sweden have been enhanced first partners to NATO and then enhanced partners to NATO. So we've been as close as NATO members as you could be. And my husband just joined our NATO delegation. He's sent there by the Ministry of Defense. And the experience we have now, we thought we knew what NATO was about. Now we have an invitee status. We have looked under the hood of NATO. There's so much more. We had no clue about all the things going on, all the committees, and now we have to really go into the defense plan. Well, not yet, but we have to understand the defense planning cycles of NATO, the operational planning and so on. It's something completely different than being a partner. So we thought we knew, but there's so much more to it. And we have been so warmly welcomed. And then again, thank you so much for being here today. It's a great honor to meet you all.
But I want to rebound on that question because, of course, one simple explanation is the war happens. It's a shock to the Swedish and Finnish public opinion. Public attitude changes drastically. But you did mention that there are years of building cooperation prior to that. And I think in particular, my understanding since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. So to what extent, if you take the slightly long view, has this building up of a partnership, a building up of a habit of cooperation has facilitated this path for both the Finnish and Swedish governments, maybe?
I think the fact that Finland was able to make very quick process, I think the US Senate did ratify the NATO application already in actually early August. So most of the NATO countries were easy. It was easy for them to accept Finland and Sweden because they knew that we meet the criteria and we are ready. We are ready in so many ways, militarily, technologically, politically, and so on. I think one important aspect about Finland is that the conflict we are seeing in Ukraine, the Russian aggression, this is exactly the kind of conflict we have been preparing for decades. We never forgot this possibility. So we've had a very strong national defense, also a national military identity. I would say that that's very much part of the culture. So it was a very strong feature in our culture, and it also meant that we basically felt that with the Russia that existed before the attack, that we can manage this kind of a situation. When the attack started, I think the conclusion among the people was that in order to preserve peace, we actually need to increase the deterrence. And how do you increase the deterrence? You actually join the alliance, you increase the cooperation, plus you invest more heavily in national defense. So I think it was we had a long tradition. We had both in terms of getting ready nationally and in terms of staying engaged with NATO. But I think then we concluded that this is a new situation. We have to take the final step right now, and that's why we did it.
Well, for us, after the Second World War, Sweden has been neutral and military non-aligned since 1814. So we've been outside both the First World War and the Second World War. And when the Cold War started, we had to make our neutrality at the time believable. We had to have a very strong defense industry. So we build our own fighter jets, we build our own submarines, we build most of our weapons ourselves. So today we are a huge exporter of arms. And we also, at that time during the Cold War, had a defense budget on 3 to 4%. And then the Soviet Union fell. And we all thought, at least in Sweden, I think it was never believed as, it was not as rosy seen in Finland as it was in Sweden. So our defense spending went down basically to 1%. We thought it was a bright new day. We joined the European Union in 94. And there was never, ever at that time a discussion if we should join NATO. It was, the EU was as far as we could go because of our history. So we've always had this very strong defense sector, and that was just as Finland part of our identity, but then we dismantled it. But then we realized at the end of the 1990s that 1% doesn't cut it. And we saw a different neighborhood starting to emerge. So we increased our defense spending gradually, still relying very much on our own defense industry, but also very much on cooperation with the United States, for instance. And then Sweden and Finland has had, before we decided to join NATO, as close as defense relationship as you can have between two countries. So we were down to operational planning together. So the transformation, I think, has been gradual, and because we have been now a member of the European Union for so long, we are kind of used to being in such a union. And now it's another union, but it's still something where it's about solidarity, and we had to be part of, I think, the European Union first before we could ever consider joining NATO, because that was such a different animal to our history. But then gradually, as Mikko also said, what we've seen over the years, and now this horrible attack on a totally innocent, sovereign, democratic country in Europe really made us realize that we cannot rely or trust our neighbor whatsoever. This is a totally unpredictable, huge neighbor we have. And just as anecdotally, Sweden has been in about 60 wars between the year 1000 and 1814, and most of them were with Russia and other European countries.
So side note, as an Irish citizen, it's interesting to see the extent to which a war has also questioned the idea of neutrality in Europe and how sustainable is it. So, but I want to obviously address, the current block to joining is very much centered on the role of Turkey. And so I wanted to ask maybe two questions. One is, to what extent do you view this as driven by domestic Turkish politics, and therefore once the election is out of the way, you have maybe higher hopes? And secondly, to what extent does the delay that we're seeing, is that starting to affect public support either in Finland or in Sweden for joining?
Yes, because maybe I should start that, because Turkey's concern has never really been about Finland. It's been about Sweden and forces in Sweden related to PKK, the terrorist organization or terrorist group in Turkey, which has been on EU's terror list for many, many years. So this has really been the case, and the Turks and President Erdogan assured us when we wanted to join that Turkey was very positive, but then something changed. And we have now, since the NATO summit in Madrid last summer, have had a memorandum of understanding, so an agreement between Turkey, Sweden, and Finland on some measures that we should cooperate around. And we feel now that we have fulfilled all those. We have delivered on all of those. One outstanding issue is that we changed our constitution. It's a little bit easier to change the constitution in Sweden than it is in the United States. But still, but it still has to be between two elections, and we had an election in the fall. And so this was a legislation we had coming before to make it illegal to be a member of a terrorist organization. Of course, these people usually don't walk around with T-shirts and membership cards, but still. And then we have a implementing law that comes into force 1st of June. So that's when we feel that the last piece of this MOU, when it comes to what we have to do, is finalized. But we are committed to a long, forever cooperation with Turkey, which we have started on exchange on, terrorism activities. We have committed to selling arms sales to them. We have already done that, and other issues as well. So we were really hoping and thinking that, we have shown Turkey that we are really taking their concerns very seriously, which we have to take all allies' concerns very seriously. But now, of course, before this awful earthquake, we started feeling that this was probably part of domestic policy in Turkey. There's an election, as you said. Now we don't know what happens given the circumstances in Turkey, which are, of course, terrible. But we really hope that we will be members by the next summit of NATO, which is in Vilnius this summer. Because I just want to add, the security situation in our area is worsening. So, this is not something that can drag on forever, and we only play into the hands of Putin. So it's important that this happens soon.
I mean, we don't even know the date of the Turkish election. It's supposed to be in June, but might be brought forward. At least that was postponed. Let me ask, Sweden and Finland did move together, but should it come to that point, is the option of Finland going first on the table? Or is that something that you would want to avoid at all costs?
Well, basically, like Karin said, we applied together. So we've been moving hand in hand, and that continues to be the case. Recently, President Erdogan has commented even a couple of times saying that actually they have no problems with Finland. Like Sweden, we feel that we have fulfilled the MOU we signed in last July. So we feel that we fulfill all those promises that we made, commitments that we made to Turkey. So that should be all out of the way. Erdogan's comments on about the readiness of Turkey to accept Finland or ratify Finland separately, I mean, this is the situation that we have to assess. We haven't seen them taking any action, and we have to remember that those comments were made just a few days before the horrible earthquake. So we don't know what kind of an impact that will have on the process. I think from our side, we continue to move together with Sweden. If Turkey will, for some reason, ratify it unilaterally and only decide to ratify Finland, this is definitely then in the hands of the Finnish parliament, whose role is to ratify our own national accession treaty. So it will, obviously, as a diplomat in a parliamentary democracy, I can't give orders or limitations to our parliament. So it will be in their hands at that point. And obviously diplomats don't like to engage in hypothetical discussions, but I say only one thing. Whatever happens, we will stay together with Sweden. We will coordinate with Sweden everything. I think this is my second time today I meet with Karin. I mean, we spent last evening together. I mean, I don't know what happens tomorrow, but basically, it simply shows that we are so closely intertwined in terms of not only history, we were in the same state for 700 years, which gives you an idea. And obviously, militarily, economically, politically, I can't foresee a situation in which Finland is a member to NATO and Sweden stays out. It's not part of the plan.
For the record, I mean, Hungary also has not ratified, so it's 28 of 30. So I don't want to necessarily single out Turkey only, for the record. But you mentioned diplomats don't like hypotheticals, but academics do over-engage in those. So, sorry, what else would we talk about? So let me ask you, maybe if accession happens, what do you see as Finland and Sweden's respective greatest contributions to the alliance? How will that change the alliance if that is to happen?
Well, now we don't have a map. I wish we had a map. But if you look at the map and you see Denmark, Norway, and then you have the Baltic republics and you have Poland and Germany, Sweden and Finland are the two missing pieces in the puzzle of the northern defense of Europe, or the defense of Northern Europe. So we both are, great military powers. We have high quality military armies and navies and air forces. So we will be a net contributor to security for NATO. And also you will see the Baltic Sea basically becoming a NATO sea. So Russia will have one outlet, and that's St. Petersburg, and then you have Kaliningrad. So of course this also limits the Russians' space of maneuver in this area. And also for serious defense planning, you need our territories. And also when we look north, kind of with joining forces with US and Canada, UK and Iceland, that strengthens that whole part of the world as well. So we are, and also we are joining as, a responsible partner and ally to all NATO members. So we really take this 360 perspective on it, and we take it. Swedes and Finns have a tendency to take everything extremely serious. So I think we will be an over-eager allies at NATO.
Commendable quality.
I think I would say that Finland will bring three things. First of all, it's a long-established democratic country. So you will get an A-class democracy, a stable political system into an alliance. Secondly, it's a technologically capable country. Finland is, just to give an example, Finland is one of the roughly 10 countries in the world capable of building quantum computer. Nokia networks, more than half of your internet traffic in the US goes via the Finnish Nokia equipment. So it gives you the picture. So the NATO will get those technical capabilities. Thirdly, like Karin said, military strength. I think Finland is a kind of, we used to be the odd man out in Europe, in the sense that everybody else was saying that, well, Finns, the wars are not what they used to be anymore. You seem to be getting ready for a kind of a large-scale invasion. They don't happen no more. So why do you do this? Why do you still need tanks? Why do you need the biggest artillery in Europe after Russia? Why do you do this old style stuff? Like Karin said, and like I said, we never forgot about this possibility. So not only in terms of hardware, you will also gain a country with a deep strategic culture and way of thinking. As regards our neighborhood with Russia, I think we will bring quite deep understanding of the challenges. And by deep, I don't mean simply that we are kind of extremely nervous or sort of somehow too concerned. I think we have a long history. We've been there always. We always had to take into account that we have this big neighbor, which is politically, they have totally different DNA. We somehow have to coexist. So I think you will get a rather sort of deep and sophisticated understanding of the neighborhood, which comes handy in the future, because I think we will gonna have rather challenging neighbor, not only to us, but all the other Europeans as well. And so fundamentally, I think Finnish and Swedish membership will strengthen the deterrence in the Northern Europe. And the strengthened deterrence is the best guarantee for keeping peace in the Northern Europe and stability. And this is what we are after.
And if you don't call through Nokia, you call through Ericsson, because we have the other half of the market.
It's also worth mentioning that it would double the size of the border between NATO and Russia as well, if that accession happens. Of course, we are getting close to the 1-year anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine. And I think if we look back, many experts and people focus that the war has unfolded in a way very differently than we expected, specifically in terms of Ukraine's resilience and ability to continue fighting. But that raises now a very different set of questions. What does the end game look like? We hear a lot of, we want Ukraine to win, but I'm not always convinced that there is agreement about what does that mean. So I'm curious about, how do you view what does the end game mean in this case? What would if there is a diplomatic arrangement, what does that look like? Help us imagine a little bit. I know it's hypothetical again, but.
Well, it's very hard to see what end game will look like because we are still in the phase of start game. I think it's going to be a long conflict. And we have to remind ourselves that it started already more than 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago. So it's been over a decade when Russians are trying to first limit and partly occupy Ukraine. Now they are trying to go all the way to take most of the country. So I don't think there's any easy solution to this. And frankly, usually people say that, well, all the wars end in some peace agreements. Yes, that might be technically true, but usually they end after some military result is achieved. So unfortunately, it's very hard to see any short-term solution, what kind of military result there could be. I think for the Russians, it's an existential conflict in the sense that personally, I don't see that President Putin has a way out because it's a kind of, it's almost the only item on the political agenda. And I don't think he is ready to sell to the Russian society any other solution than something which looks like a victory. At the same time, I think we see President Zelensky, who is defending his own legal territory against an illegal invasion. Obviously, Ukrainians are not, and we are not certainly ready to accept an unfair peace. So this is going to go on for quite a long time. Then small addition. I think the Russian society that was there before the conflict is something different right now. So we can't go back to that situation in a year ago. So what kind of an impact that will have? So Russia will be, it's a different society and it will continue the transformation. Economically, it's going to be different. It's going to be different in so many ways, also politically. So, so what I'm saying is that it's a moving target and everything is in transformation. So that's why we should avoid being kind of a mechanical that it's Russia, Ukraine, they find some agreement. It's far more complicated than that. And the conflict has unleashed forces also within the Russian society that it's very hard to predict what does it mean in the long run.
I totally agree with Mikko. I would just like to add something. My government and most governments in Europe, we stress the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Of course, it's up to the Ukrainian people to decide when they want the war to end. But if the war ends without the territorial integrity of Ukraine intact, what message does that send to bigger powers around the world? It means you can grab a piece of land of a smaller country and nothing really happens. I mean, of course, a lot of people have died and we have a horrible war. But we have international law. We are members of the United Nations, all of us. And this is really serious. And it makes the situation for smaller countries so much worse. No matter where you are around the world, if you have a bigger neighbor, it makes the world very insecure. And of course, it is up to the Ukrainians, but that's why we always stress the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
This is a prominent English expert on Russia and Putin who described it as his mindset was a return to sort of 19th century imperialism. And I think that's definitely a concern. For time, I won't ask this question now, but I think it's worth thinking also that we used to talk about the German question for most of the 20th century, but there will be a 21st Russian question. What kind of place would Russia have in any future European security order? That is a big question. But for time, I want to shift to something a little bit different because if you follow the news, I gather there was a lot of attraction towards a certain balloon floating across the United States, that sort of captivated audiences for a whole week. And this is a bridge to talk about China. And I know Finland, Sweden, and I would say the Nordic countries have definitely toughened their attitudes towards China in the last few years. So maybe the first question, can you maybe give your perspective as to why Sweden and Finland have hardened their attitudes towards China in the last 5-6 years? What have been the key forces, the key driving factors to change course?
Well, I think it's been technology driven. We have seen what China can do through its both not always technology, but investments in our countries. Some investments are really good. Volvo Cars is owned by a Chinese company, and that's doing very well. And we are extremely happy with that investment. So one can't do, treat everything Chinese as something bad. On the contrary, but we have to be very careful of what kind of investments, for instance, we have. What is the real purpose behind it? We have the technology part of it. When we were rolling out our 5G network, our postal service, which is the agency that deals with this, said explicitly, Huawei and CTE cannot be part of the Swedish 5G rollout. And, but at the same time, China is a big trading nation. It's a global power, but we, of course, must be very, look at them carefully and be concerned and not be naive, of course. But it's a tricky situation, I think, and a tricky relationship where we, of course, are interested in their technology and markets and so on. And I just read that I think Walmart, 80% of what they sell at Walmart is produced in China.
I think in our case, I don't think we have hardened our position towards China specifically. I think we are becoming more mindful and critical towards certain actions by the Chinese state. And obviously, the Chinese power has been growing, but we are being carefully looking at those signs of what it means if the Chinese are now trying or getting ready to break the international law to sort of bypass the rules of international order. So I think we are getting ready for, and we are already signaling to China that this is something that we cannot accept. We have the same kind of practical concerns with investments, technology like Sweden has. And it must be said that we are both European Union countries, member states, which also means that China is for us, like it is for the US, many things. It's a trading partner, but it's also systemic rival, as we call it, in the European Union. So we have to differentiate between different aspects of what China means. Obviously, nobody wants to become an enemy of China or wants to sort of create a conflict, but it also depends on how well the Chinese behavior stays within the limits of international law. Because if it doesn't stay, then it means that the international order will be under threat, and this is going to be a big. And also, by the way, how Chinese-Russian relations will evolve in the context of this conflict. Because if China will take sides with Russia against the international law, which is Ukraine's integrity, then it also means something for the Europeans very directly.
So I want to give a notice to those in the audience. I'm going to ask one more question. So I invite you to, if you want to ask questions, and please do, there's a big crowd. So I invite you to line up behind the microphone in the middle. And so be prepared and looking forward to your questions. I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question that relates to trade, because my colleague, Professor Michel Egan, is here. There's been the State of the Union yesterday talked a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act, a large bill passed by the Biden administration, which has certain sort of large subsidies and protectionist angles. If you think about the large subsidies, for instance, that would be offered to the making of electric vehicles, that could have an influence on European companies and pressuring them to relocate to the United States. And as representative of two innovative, committed to free trade nations, I'm curious about, are there concerns with the degree arguably protectionism that we're seeing in the Biden administration. It may not be quite as flashy as the trade wars or the tariff wars that we saw with Trump, but there is some more continuity that meets the eye.
Well, obviously we have concerns, but I think we have to also here with IRA, we have to kind of be mindful of the fact that obviously we support the fact that the US is really taking this green transition seriously. We wholeheartedly support that approach. And we also understand the goal of the US to re-industrialize the country. This is also something that I think our companies will benefit down the road. So there are huge pluses in this legislation, and we fully, as European Union, we acknowledge that. But then these, I would say, rather restrictive rules as regards how the foreign companies are being treated, these are a cause of concern. And this has also led to a situation in which the European Union is negotiating with the US on how this will be then implemented in practice. And the results of this process are really important for our companies. And let's be honest here, I mean, we wouldn't like to see a kind of a state aid race to beginning, that the US gives a lot of state aid to its companies and then have to reciprocate. This will not be in the interest of taxpayer. And then I'll just give you a small example. This protectionism is not good, perhaps, but it's actually really costly. I'm not gonna state the place or any names, but there's one place in US, they are trying to sort of replace a vessel fleet for public services. And I met with the people who are running the operation. I asked what is the target price for the ship, for one ship? They said, well, roughly 200 million. I said, what is the sort of market price in Europe? If you would be able to order it from Europe, the price is 35. So it means a lot to a taxpayer. If there's less competition, you will pay more. So I think we have to be mindful of this. And if the Europeans and the US, if we start to compete each other to death in terms of all kinds of trade restrictions, then we know that we will be both worse off, and then there will be others, not so countries which do not like democracies too much, which will benefit from this. So I think we have to keep this competition under control.
I think Mikko gave a perfect answer, and I see there are many people who wants to pose a question. So that was brilliant, Mikko.
I
earned your salary today.
A few instructions. Let's all be polite, so please introduce yourselves. Number two, it has to have a question mark at the end. That's worth repeating. Thirdly, also, if it's a question addressed to a specific ambassador, please let us know, and we'll take a couple in a row just to be efficient.
Thank you very much for being here. My name is Christopher Kiase. I am a master's student in the School of Public Affairs, focusing on political science and Arctic security and climate change. My question to you, as a scholar of the Arctic and as experts in the Arctic yourself, I'm sure, is what explains the approximate 47% reduction in military activity or exercises within the Arctic region following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as opposed to prior? Is it okay to take maybe three questions?
I have just a very bad memory.
Okay. We'll work together. I'm bad as well, so yeah.
Atul Singh, I'm the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, a world affairs website, journal, whatever you call it. We have 2,500 plus authors, including from both your countries. Quick question. You mentioned Russia and China might be entering into a new configuration. Do you see the current time as reminiscent of pre-World War I, when Austria-Hungary and Germany got together?
Take one more, and then we'll try to work our memories.
Hello, my name is Justin Hinckley. I'm a graduate student here at the School of International Service. I'm also in a practicum on Arctic policy right now. My question relates to that. Since the suspension of activities in the Arctic Council following the war of Ukraine, there have been concerns about how it can be brought back. So I'm curious, what conditions do your government say need to be met for the resumption of activities in the Arctic Council?
Okay, so I had reduction of exercise in the Arctic, historical analogy was pre-1914, and resumption of activity in the Arctic Council.
I can start on the last one.
Sure.
Well, right now, the 7 non-Russian countries in the Arctic Council are cooperating. We will soon all be NATO members. Right now, I don't think we see any time within near future that we would resume that cooperation with Russia. Of course, we don't know what will happen in the future, but as Mikko said, and I also said, this is probably something that will take a long time, this war. We can't say, but most likely it's very, very long in the future. But it's very important that the rest of us continue to cooperate for so many reasons. Both security, of course, which is not really on the agenda of the Arctic Council, but climate issues, indigenous peoples issues, and so on. So there are so many issues that we need to continue to cooperate on. So therefore, I'm very happy that the members, all the rest of us are still taking this very seriously, because it is a region that really needs our attention.
Well, on the Arctic Council, nothing to add. I think on the first question on the exercises, I don't think we have reduced any exercises. Perhaps the data is based on some rather fractional kind of moment, but basically the exercises are continuing as they have been planned. I think the direction has been mainly on the increase of the exercises. There's no dramatic increase either, but I think they're fairly stable. One has to remind ourselves that anything like, for example, Finland does, all our armed forces are Arctic armed forces. So not all of Finland is above the Arctic Circle, but anything that sort of works in Finland, it has to be Arctic. So, I mean, whatever we do is Arctic always by definition. Then on the systemic issue, I think this is really one of the big and fundamental questions of today. I actually wrote about that on the Finnish media just last week, so I can't escape that issue at all. But I don't sort of claim that there is an historical analogy in the direct sense of the words, but still I'm slightly concerned about these things, because we know that before the First World War, before the second one, there are different conflicts ongoing here and there. If you remember Second World War, you had Spanish Civil War, you had Italian attack on Ethiopia, you had Japanese attack on China. So things start before they start in history books. So are we in a similar situation? So I think we cannot dismiss that possibility right out of hand. And then instead of focusing only on what Russia does in Ukraine, what is that conflict, how it will end, I think we'll have to keep in mind the larger canvas and the risks involved. So no definitive reply, but I think this is something we have to think seriously.
No, I just add that it's easy, and I many times focus on the economic links between, for instance, the United States and China, but those countries that we talked about before the First World War were also economically interlinked. So I sometimes wonder if I'm wrong in thinking that this economic relationship and 80% of Walmart being from China kind of will keep us from this getting more and more serious. But let's hope I'm right.
All right, let's take 3 more again. And again, please channel your inner concise self, because there's a lot of people behind you. So please.
Hi, my name is Brody. Thank you for coming here and talking today. In the international community, we've been hearing a lot about how the Nordic entrance into NATO is going to systematically change NATO and Europe fundamentally. But I wanted to pose a reflexive question to that of how do you think this Nordic ascension into NATO will change Sweden and Finland systematically? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Makar. I am an undergraduate student here at the School of International Service. My question is about the identity of NATO. So NATO was created as a way to counterbalance the rise of communism in Europe. And with the fall of communism and this war in Ukraine, how do you think NATO's shift in purpose and identity is currently going and how it will move forward?
Okay, let's take one more.
Hello, my name is Edward. I'm also an undergrad student here at SIS. And so my cousin, he is a Finnish permanent resident and an immigrant to Finland. And well, what we witnessed recently and from him as well is rising hostility towards immigrants in the European Union. We saw the burning of the Quran in Sweden a couple of weeks ago. And my question is that to what extent do you think Finland and Sweden's application to NATO and the war in Ukraine have contributed to the rise of ultranationalism domestically? Thank you.
Oh, it's about the extent to which accession to NATO might change sort of the identity or it's about us. Yeah.
Yes. No, but we have been very, how do you say, fierce in saying that we are joining for the security of all allies. Then we have our geographical location, of course. But for us, it's extremely important to show the southern parts of Europe and of NATO that we are a serious partner to them as well. So it's not about regionalization of the alliance. Of course, our two countries are closer to the conflict and the war than, for instance, Portugal is. But that doesn't mean that we don't take their security seriously, just as we hope that they will also take our security seriously. So this is all easy to say as an incoming member, but knowing my country, this is really what we will do.
Well, in the Finnish case, I think I try to be brutally honest here. Like Sweden, we had been cooperating with NATO for decades. So we thought we knew. But I think in our case, there is a fundamental philosophy, which was that we will fight alone. So changing this kind of software from fighting alone, whatever happens, into a fighting together always, is it's a major step. So it's going to require a lot of resources, but it's going to require a change in the mindset. And as you all understand, changing mindset is not an easy thing to do. It takes time. It happens in steps. So I think we have embarked on a long road towards that. I'm not saying that we will be somehow a difficult ally, no. But I'm simply saying that there's a lot of adjustment to be done in our case. And still we have to remind all the allies that it's a different thing to be a kind of a frontline country than have a different geographical location. Maps do matter. So for us, defending our own territory automatically means that we are defending not only Sweden, Norway, but all of NATO. So obviously our focus is, because of the long border, is somewhat different than, for example, Ireland.
And as if I understood the NATO treaty, the Atlantic Treaty, of course, the defense of your own country is paramount to being an ally as well. If I can answer the third question, I think there's been a paradigm shift in all our strategic thinking. After 9/11, it was terrorism far away that we were dealing with, and we went to Afghanistan and so on. There's been a shift in the United States. If you look at the national security strategies that have been coming out the last years, the United States is, China is the pacing threat, and right now Russia is the acute threat, as it was formulated before. And the United States doesn't see itself anymore as the world's police. And I think that goes for the rest of us as well, given that the tensions have risen closer to home. This is what we have to focus on now, unfortunately. So there is a paradigm shift which I think is also what happens at NATO. that it is the defense of the territory of NATO that is central. And of course, terrorism and what we did in Afghanistan and other places, of course, has been extremely important as well, because it's kind of an indirect defense of our territories. But I think I believe it has shifted more to like classical territorial defense.
If I sort of respond to this ultranationalism, I don't think we have a national phenomenon of anything like that. All the parties in our parliaments, they fully subscribe to our constitution, which is democratic, and which also protects all the rights of minorities, be they ethnic, sexual, etc., etc. So I don't think the fundamentals have moved an inch. Obviously, like in any country, you have individual cases of hate crimes, intolerance, things like that. I just want to add that we now have currently have more than 40,000 Ukrainian refugees, which is actually a huge number in a small country of 5.5 million. I think the US quota is roughly 100,000. So we haven't really seen a single act of protest against that. And people are rather supportive of those things. So I think it's all relative. So obviously we can't exclude that individual cases happen, but we have a rule of law, we have police, we have courts that protect people regardless of their origin, and we will keep it that way, obviously.
Well, I think there's certainly nativist pressures across the Atlantic. I think that's something which has been very striking, even if it's not exactly materializes in the same way. A lot of the challenges that we face on both sides of the Atlantic, whether positive values or negative challenges, are there. And I think we've got to be mindful. You've been
What was the second question? I mean, we kind of missed that. Do you remember the second question?
Oh, it was about the extent to which NATO has changed.
What I try to answer.
Take my class. Yeah, take my class. I'll tell you all about it. We will chat afterwards, I promise. You've been very patient, so if we could take at least those last three questions. So please, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Duchoma Gomes. My first question is directed to the Finnish ambassador. You made mention of ambassadors not embarking on hypotheticals. So I would love you to clarify that, if that may be, because it is my understanding that strategy is always built on hypotheticals. And my second question is directed to the Swedish ambassador. What would you say to the calculated risk of the United States to send tanks to Ukraine together with its allies, and the non-boundary cooperation between China and Russia? So how do you evaluate all of that, given the fact that you're getting into NATO? Thank you.
Thank you. Is it okay if we take the last two?
Hello, my name is Isabella Nieminen. I am an Italian Finn coming from Tampere, Finland. I study international affairs and philosophy at George Washington University. I have a general question for the both of you. I often hear arguments that I disagree with, though I can't necessarily articulate why. You often hear arguments from Russia and even scholars that I'm reading in school, like John Mearsheimer, characterizing NATO expansion as being a direct driver of conflict between Russia and Europe, and how expansion would only instigate Russian aggression. I was wondering how both of you might specifically respond to such an argument. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Scott Capone. I'm a first-year student at American University. Thank you for your presentation, by the way. I'm from, my family lives in Italy, and oftentimes every time I go there, I see US military personnel everywhere because a lot of US military is there. So with your process to joining NATO, do you guys expect a buildup in US military forces within your country, especially in Finland, with you guys sharing a long border with Russia? Thank you.
Okay, so we have the hypothetical question, we have the question about the tanks, we have the question about the famous Russian narrative and the 1990 fake promise, and then we have the question about bases and military presence if you were to join. Whichever one you want to pick.
I start with the hypotheticals. I think the problem with the hypotheticals is that a diplomat, an ambassador, represents his or her government. So if I engage in a kind of a discussion that what we will do if A or B happens, it kind of it theoretically ties the hands of my government. It sort of it gives, in certain contexts, it might give sort of the opponent already a knowledge of how would we react. So there are all kinds of problems. And the third problem might be that I may look ridiculous if I get it all wrong. So which is not the least of problems in the human scale of things. So I think it's always a bit of a risky thing. It doesn't mean that we don't engage in hypotheticals, but we do it, of course, privately or in closed settings. So publicly, we are careful not to commit our government or our thinking to any particular scenario before it happens.
We just had lunch, all our the Nordic ambassadors, and like I said, it was a lot of hypotheticals there, but
There's nothing else than hypotheticals.
No, exactly. If I can answer the question about NATO expansion, it is every country's sovereign right to decide their own security framework, period. So, and then it's of course up to each organization to decide if it wants more members or not. So I don't think it's for Russia or any other country to decide what my country's security framework should be. Then, of course, NATO can decide, as this is the organization we are applying to, that no, we don't want Sweden as a member. That's those countries' full right, but it's our full right to try to frame our own security. And I think that's extremely important. Why should anyone else decide for us? And I mean, it would be terrible. So I think it's quite easy to answer, actually.
I think I just continue on the same topic as Karin said. I think the problem that people don't ask often enough is that why is it so that countries try to get away from Russia at all means? I mean, we kind of the question by Mersheimer is like as if the Russian position is something natural and it's kind of how we have to take into account. But I mean, for some strange reason, countries which have an opportunity try to make some distance between them and Russia. So I think the Russians have a marketing problem, to be honest. I mean, and I think, frankly, the Russians are totally incapable of facing that issue, that what is wrong with us and our system, that everybody that has a chance tries to run as fast as they can the first moment appears. And I have to say that Finland, like Sweden, we were not trying to get into NATO at any price. We were basically, like Karin said, quite content, not totally content perhaps, but quite content with the situation as it was. I actually said to Russians before the attack that if you move, I think this will cause a change also in Finland. But nevertheless, they decided to move. So I think this is one of the fundamental, also top of the right aspect. Then I think the Russians, the problem here is that they even started to discuss about joining NATO themselves back in the 90s. This was also one of the comments even Putin himself made more than 20 years ago. But for some reason, they then concluded that NATO is a kind of an enemy organization and tries to take away something from Russia. But here again, the problem is that why do the Russians kind of oppose expansion of NATO? I have a suspicion. The reason is that these countries are then less kind of vulnerable towards their own designs. And I think these countries have a fairly good reason then to join. So I think the Russian narrative is the fundamental problem here is that they are incapable of facing the consequences and also testing their own basic beliefs. And if you know the NATO, how it functions, and frankly, if you see how the Europeans, for example, how do they develop their own defense and what they have done in the past decades, I mean, can anyone seriously think that NATO is getting ready to attack Russia. I mean, can you imagine any European or even US parliaments that let's go there? I mean, it's all so insane as a theory. But this is a defensive alliance. We are not joining the NATO in order to be better equipped to fight the war, but rather stay out of the war. That is the purpose of NATO.
Can I ask you to respond to the second question about the risk calculation with sending the various tanks to Ukraine? I mean, how do you see the trade-offs?
Well, first when this war started, we basically didn't want to send anything. And then we could send some things. And the next thing they asked for, we couldn't send that. And then we sent it. And so we have been, really, increased our support with more and more sophisticated and needed weapons. And I think it's, the next thing we're talking about now is fighter jets. I wouldn't be surprised if it's fighter jets, even though we've said we would never send fighter jets, because, and this is all sounds like a cliche, but the Ukrainians are fighting our war, and we have to, provide them with everything we can. So this is really important. And then we all say, oh, it takes a long time to train. But Ukrainians seems to be geniuses in learning quite quickly. I don't remember if you saw that grenade launcher where they had a joke. It had an IKEA description on how to operate it. But it turns, and I think this will, what we learn from Ukrainians fighting, I think will be decisive on how we look at our own defense later on. Apparently, we are very much capable, at least the Ukrainians are, in being very fast in adapting and using the technologies they get, et cetera, because they are fighting for their life. And I think that's what you do then.
So I want to conclude, I want to first, of course, mention, do we have one more question?
Oh, no, but I have my question. Oh, you had, it's fine, I'm reading.
It might be me as well. So I wanted to conclude by mentioning that we have some wonderful events coming up. On Friday, we have Dame Karen Pierce coming to the Doyle Foreman Theatre for an event on the future of UK diplomacy. I am very curious. We have, it will be formally announced very soon, but we will have your colleagues, the Italian, Irish, and Danish ambassadors will be here in early March as part of Women's History Month. I want to warmly thank SIS, the Transatlantic Policy Center, also Ask a Diplomat, and of course the Finnish and Swedish Embassy. It's a delight to work with all of you, and it's always a pleasure. And also, of course, thank our esteemed panelists for taking the time to engage with us and our students. And of course, thank all of you, because there's a real pleasure having a full room engaging with this. This is so important, and we're so glad that we can do it. So please join me in thanking our two ambassadors.
Really, thank you for coming. Such a pleasure.